Um, so I wanted to start by just underlining that we're very excited that real progress is being made in the stem cell and regenerative medicine field to combat some of our most feared diseases, including Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and blindness. Research advances are really moving quite rapidly into the clinic. When you think, for example, that induced pluripotent stem cells were first described in the literature in 2007 for human, and then the first induced pluripotent stem cell-derived cell products were put into the clinic in clinical trials just 7 years later. So this is an exciting moment, but at the same time, we are really facing a significant challenge right now, and that is that the concept of being able to repair tissues and to use the unique properties of stem cells and the promise of novel therapy development from stem cells is being co-opted. There is a proliferation of clinics offering what are purported to be treatments for numerous diseases, and they're preying on people who may have no other hope for cures. And of course, they're charging high prices for this. And because these so-called therapies are not fully tested, and in fact, often aren't tested at all, some really serious consequences are being reported, including paralysis, including blindness, and in fact, death. So this is causing an incredible burden. It causes, obviously, a burden to patients, families, both physical and financial. And it really threatens to undermine the legitimate work that is being done throughout the world following rigorous regulations and guidelines. So these clinics became prominent in some countries outside the US because of lax regulation, but now they are proliferating in the US with over 500 clinics here today, and the number is growing worldwide. We face several misconceptions that these clinics rely on in order to persuade patients to accept unproven therapies and participate. For example, that autologous means safe. That is, if a stem cell is derived from your body, it's perfectly safe to put it anywhere else in your body. The second misconception, a major misconception, is that stem cells are a panacea and they can cure anything at all, while instead there are different sorts of stem cells that have different properties, different effectiveness, and different risks associated with their use. So public information is absolutely key so that patients and other stakeholders, also clinicians, can thoroughly understand the risks before deciding whether or not to participate. And I often ask prospective patients, think about what is in the syringe. If you're contemplating a therapy, what is in that syringe? What type of stem cells are they? What species? How were they prepared? Have they been tested for infectious agents? So without this type of information, just on the component alone, patients are put at grave risk. And they really need to know what the product is, and also whether or not it's been tested, especially for their particular disease. So patients and physicians are asking, what is legitimate? And is there hope, real hope, for a viable treatment for my condition or their patient's conditions? In addition to this clear threat from clinics that are basically putting up a shingle and saying, this is what we can do, we can cure your disease with stem cells. In addition to that, there's another potential source of unproven therapies. The loosening of regulations in the US and other countries around the world, which is intended to accelerate therapy development, means that appropriate testing with proper controls may not be done on a particular product. And the danger is that this is a second way that unproven therapies can enter the marketplace, following actually this loosened regulatory path. ISSCR has a long history of addressing the issues of unproven therapies and has several resources to help patients understand the differences between legitimate trials and therapies versus unproven therapies. And today, we bring together this panel of experts on regulation, translation, therapy development, and delivery. And first, we're going to hear from Doug Sipp. Thanks, Doug.
Thanks, Sally. So I'll be filling in for Professor Altacharo, who was scheduled originally to talk about the regulatory landscape and some of the problems and issues that have been allowing this proliferation of clinics, but also the introduction of some kind of regulatory reforms in various countries. So the first question that she wanted to address was, how does the regulatory environment allow these clinics to operate? Why is it that the FDA is not regulating or enforcing the law in the US? And why do doctors who do these kind of businesses still have their licenses? So the FDA does have regulations over cell and human cell and tissue-based products, and they've been in force since the mid-2000s. And basically, they set some definitions for what types of human cell and tissue products are reviewed and approved in the same way as other drugs or devices. And so those definitions are basically, does the processing of that product, does it involve altering it from its natural state? And, are you intending to use that cell in a different context other than the one that it normally operates in the body? Or are you expecting it to have some kind of system-wide drug-like effects on, for example, the metabolism? So the FDA does have a number of clear definitions that set forth what types of stem cells, for example, they would consider to be a biologic drug. But there are also some features of the existing law which act effectively as loopholes, which permit the proliferation of clinics that we've seen in the US in recent years. And the most important one of those is essentially there's an exception that's set forth that says that if you do harvest cells and then re-implant them in the course of the same surgical procedure, then that is exempt from this body of federal law. And so clinics and other businesses in the US that are marketing and aggressively advertising so-called stem cell cures to patients, for the most part at this point, claim to be doing same surgical procedure-based operations and therefore are exempt from FDA oversight. So that's kind of, at least in this country, one of the reasons, the main reasons why this industry has been thriving in recent years. So the next area that Alta asked me to talk about is whether this indeed is a gray area of regulation, and are there proposed regulations by the FDA or other bodies, and basically what can be done to address the issue. So the answer is yes, there are some proposed changes to the regulation. In 2014 and 2015, FDA released 4 what are called draft guidance documents. So these are amendments to the existing rules, including, importantly, the definition of what constitutes that so-called same surgical procedure. So the FDA appeared to be seeking to tighten up the definition and therefore, if not completely close the loophole, at least narrow the loophole so that businesses wouldn't be able to so easily exploit patient hope about stem cells. However, it's important to note that those remain in the draft stage. There was a public comment period last year, and they remain under review, but they have not gone into implementation, so the original law still stands, including that large and broadly defined exception for same surgical procedure. With respect to what can be done, so FDA has been working, I think, gradually to address the issue, but there are a number of other possibilities. So state medical boards, of course, have licensing authority in the individual states, and we've seen cases where physicians have had their licenses revoked. We've seen actually a few cases where the FBI or state police have gotten involved in cases of wrongful death. The FTC may be interested in truth in advertising aspects of this industry phenomenon. There's an Office of Professional Misconduct that looks at medical conduct issues, which may also get involved at the federal level. And of course, people always have recourse to suing the providers, either as individual malpractice suits or maybe in the future class action suits, if they feel they've been wronged. And of course, the ISSCR, as Sally mentioned, has been working in this space for a long time now and has produced a number of materials intended both for guidelines for professional conduct, but also information for patients. So some of the proposals also involve changes to tort law, and I have to confess I'm not a real expert in tort law, so I'll be brief talking about some of the ideas that are being kicked around at the state level about ways that maybe additional protections for patients can be introduced. So one of those is by requiring explicit language at the sites of these various stem cell providers, which acknowledges that they're not approved, they haven't been shown to be safe or effective for any medical condition. So it's basically a direct warning to patients that they're undertaking kind of a step into the unknown and that there's no guarantees. So that's one way, but I worry a bit about that being used as a shield by the providers themselves, because they can turn around and say, well, we told you so explicitly before you undertook this. So that's something that I think needs some discussion. Other things that you could think about would be putting limits on, for example, the ability of providers to insert clauses like non-disclosure or non-disparagement or mandatory arbitration clauses in either their informed consent or the contractual relationships with patients to just provide patients at least with a recourse to lawsuits if they are harmed or feel they've been a victim of fraud. One issue that's been in the news a lot recently here in the US is the new legislation that was just recently passed or signed by the governor in Texas, and Alta worded it as, why is this such a problem? So one of the problems with the legislation, which in brief essentially allows for physicians and businesses based in the state of Texas to provide unproven or experimental stage stem cell based procedures and products to patients in a way that apparently seeks to undermine FDA authority. But it also sets up this false narrative, which is that the FDA somehow, its operations restrict patient choice. So the real role of the FDA, of course, is to limit the ability of businesses to get into the health market in the US. And it seeks to restrict only businesses which are able, in advance of going into the market, to show that their product is safe and to show that it actually delivers clinical benefit. So the FDA does not, it's not like the DEA will arrest you if you have cocaine in your pocket. So it doesn't have any authority over consumer activity. It's all about seller activity. But the sellers have been clever and have been successful, I think, in getting patients to identify with the sellers and see the FDA as a bureaucratic intruder onto their rights. So that's, I think, one of the negative effects of that type of legislation, which we've been seeing not just for stem cell specific medicines, but we've been seeing in many US states for all types of medical products, which are the so-called right to try laws. And then the last point that Sally also briefly mentioned at the end of her introduction was this second phenomenon, which is the trend towards deregulation of approval pathways for stem cell and regenerative medicine products. It's a long story, and I don't think I should get into all the details here, but briefly, in 2011, 2012, South Korea began approving stem cell-based products on basically a fast track and a lower evidence standard. And 2 years later, the Japanese government actually changed the laws in Japan. So they introduced laws that would more strictly regulate what private practice clinics are able to do, but to lower the evidence standards required to get into the Japanese market under what's called a conditional approval. And that system was specific to regenerative medicine products. It wasn't for all medicines. So it's not for drugs, not for vaccines or devices. So once that happened, then some politicians and think tanks and patient groups in the US also began to look at that and say, we should have that same kind of freedom to get quickly into the market and to expand access to stem cell and regenerative medicine products. So there were a number of legislative efforts. Ultimately, what happened is in December 2016, a new sweeping law called the 21st Century Cures Act included a small section that introduced a new category for the FDA of a new kind of accelerated approval pathway called regenerative medicine advanced therapies. And this basically resembles an existing category called breakthrough therapy designation. And it says if you have a stem cell or cell-based product which is intended for the treatment of a serious or life-threatening condition and has shown some preliminary evidence of addressing an unmet medical need, then we will give a kind of an accelerated review to that product. And already a number of companies have applied for that so-called RMAT designation. So that's been the major change in the recent months since the election in the US. It's not entirely clear to me why that was necessary given the existence of a breakthrough therapy designation which applied to all medical products prior to that, but that's politics. So thanks for your attention.
So what I want to talk about now is reflect a little bit more about how the community sees stem cell research and what we as a scientific community have done to perhaps challenge some of the marketing that Sally's mentioned. So I thought it was helpful to start with an image of a website that promotes stem cell treatments in Southeast Asia. And you can see on the left-hand panel, there's a drop-down menu, virtually an A to Z listing of conditions that this network alleged to treat. And we can see up there anti-aging, or at least I can, perhaps you can't, but ataxia, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, traumatic brain injury. These are all areas where legitimate stem cell researchers are working on possible ways to use stem cells to perhaps understand the disease or maybe develop a cellular therapy, but we're not there yet. However, these clinics are saying that they are, and the rhetoric they employ is often around hope. And you can see at the top, we've got returning hope, bringing patients together basically with experts who can help you now. So these are really powerful messages, and we know that people are traveling to pursue them. These clinics sometimes imply they're doing clinical research, perhaps they're participating in our trial, but they really are not. They're not doing recognised research. They're operating really on a commercial basis, and I would argue exploiting the hope that patients hold in stem cell research. In lieu of having evidence about benefit, they post either directly on their websites or through perhaps their social media auxiliary sites, really compelling videos featuring the journeys of patients. Now, for someone who has been told there's no treatment for their loved one or for themselves, these testimonials are extremely captivating. And in Australia, with some research colleagues, we've interviewed over 50 Australians who've contemplated travelling or who have travelled to clinics like this in the pursuit of stem cell treatments. And they've mentioned in the interviews that we've done how useful and how crucial it was in their decision-making to look at videos such as these. The clinics also often connect patients with other previous patients, and that interaction has also perhaps encouraged others to pursue treatment. One of the other findings in our work was the high cost. Sally mentioned that these treatments are expensive. To give you some kind of parameters, people we spoke to talked about being charged anywhere between $10,000 to $100,000 per treatment. They're often encouraged to have multiple treatments, and of course this doesn't include the cost of the airfare or accommodation. So people were often turning to their community to fundraise. And I think what was really striking for me and exemplified by this quote from Lisa, who took her child with cerebral palsy to Germany, the risks associated with these treatments, it's certainly not clear on the websites, but the patients have a perception that the risks associated with PAPs are just the risks of losing their money, of doing it but having no benefit. And of course, as Sally alluded to, we are seeing really adverse outcomes from these treatments. We don't know, in many cases, what the patient's actually being injected with. However, what we do know from the patient interviews is that the way the cells or the material is given back to the patient is highly invasive. It's not just rubbing cells onto the skin, it often involves either intravenous or, in a huge percentage of the people we interviewed, lumbar puncture delivery, so intrathecal delivery of this unknown, potentially non-purified cellular material. So I think you might have already seen the coverage associated with Jim Gasson, and I think it was really brave of him and his family to come forward and take such a public stance to talk about the complications of the treatment that he had for his stroke. I also just wanted to mention, and this has been covered a little in Australia, but we had a death of a woman who had advanced dementia, and she was discharged from her nursing home with her family's support to have treatment by a cosmetic surgeon where he took adipose fat and, in a day procedure, zhushed it around, put it back intravenously into this woman, and unfortunately she passed away on the same day back in her nursing home. Really, she bled to death. So unlike in Jim's case where the cells grew into an uncontrolled tumour, she had complications due to the liposuction procedure. Now, in both cases, these treatments were pursued on a mirage. There was no demonstrated evidence to suggest that these high-risk activities were going to provide benefit. So what can we do about it? So as Sally's mentioned, we've done a lot of things at ISSCR in terms of trying to put up a demarcation between what's acceptable and what we should be looking for in terms of ethical translation of promising research. But what we've also done is put a lot of activity into informing the community. We want people to think twice. We want them to get the facts on stem cell science. So this website, A Closer Look at Stem Cells, was launched in 2015. And what we've tried to do is to create quite a dense site for people who want to know more. So this deliberately talks about the role of stem cells in medicine. And specifically, I wanted to highlight that we talk about how we take research from the lab to you. What's involved in clinical trials, legitimate clinical trials, as opposed to what's being marketed online. And part of that is a checklist and things to know, where we sort of further explain what it means if you've been asked to participate in a clinical trial. We also have a checklist about sort of things that, like Sally mentioned earlier, if the clinic's telling you that their treatment has no risk, and particularly because it uses your own cells, think twice, because it matters how the cells are prepared and delivered to you when you think about risk. We also think it's really important to contextualise stem cell research for a particular condition. The use of stem cells in multiple sclerosis, for example, and how they may be used as a therapeutic is very different to how patients with Parkinson's disease or vision loss may be treated with stem cells. And we want the community to understand that these complex conditions are often going to require a sophisticated solution. And again, this is in complete contrast to the panacea kind of silver bullet that the commercial clinics promote their services. Finally, I wanted to mention, and there's of course many other features on this website, but we have a terrific patient handbook. I think, websites are great, but if you can give people something else to download and read, particularly in their own language, it's really helpful. And I'm really proud that we have now 12 languages, the booklet translated to 12 languages. And I should mention that our website is also translated into Spanish, so there's a Spanish tab. And so we hope that this is starting a more sensible dialogue around where we actually are. At the core, a lot of this material is obviously trying to challenge the hype of the clinics that are marketing these treatments, but maintain hope in medical research, hope of a future benefit from stem cell therapies. And we think it's really important that we don't deter people from participating in appropriately conducted clinical trials. Our Closer Look at Stem Cell website is just one of the many initiatives by stem cell groups around the world, and this is a collage of different home pages from our colleague national-based initiatives. But I really feel like the ISSCR website is the glue that kind of connects all of these different national endeavours. I also wanted to conclude by saying that at the core of our patient resources is that we acknowledge that people want to find out more. I think it's great to go out and do your research to find out what's available. But it's also really important, and we reflect this quite clearly in our material, that you must take that information back to your treating doctor and have a conversation about whether what you've seen is right for you. Thank you.
So I was going to take just a few minutes to discuss the responsibilities of clinicians and what clinical trials look like, what they should look like, what they shouldn't look like, and who's responsible for that. Because obviously any patient wishing to have a therapeutic intervention will require a clinician to be involved with that process. And so I suppose, the most important things as a clinician, as a doctor, is first do no harm. That is what you swear up to as a doctor in the Hippocratic Oath, and that is what you need to stick by. And so when patients come and see you about wishing to have some stem cell therapy, it is incumbent upon that clinician to give an objective account of what that actually means. Now, one of the issues there is, of course, there are conflicts of interest, so some clinicians will be directly linked to that therapy, and therefore they may not be able to give the independent account which they need to do. But it is an essential feature of any informed consent or a patient coming to see a physician that they can actually tell them what it is that they're actually putting themselves forward for. So it's important that they understand the principles on which that therapy is based. So they need to understand and explain to the patient the rationale for that therapy. And often in many cases of stem cell tourism, there is no rationale. So how could a stem cell therapy restore your hair on one of the lists that I think Megan had up? I mean, you have to have a rationale, and you have to be extremely straightforward about the possible benefits and the possible risks that therapeutic engenders when you give it to a patient. And as we've heard from some of the other speakers, these are not innocent therapies. These are not therapies that you rub on your forehead. These are therapies which are injected into various parts of you. They're injected into your circulation, they're injected into your brain, your spine, wherever. So these are therapies which have risks, and I think one of the problems is that physicians are not, or clinicians are not honest enough about explaining the science, the risks and the benefits. And for a lot of patients, of course, they're in desperate situations. So if you have patients who have ALS, motor neurone disease, the outlook is extremely bleak. It is very hard for them to understand that your therapeutic intervention carries the risk of making them worse. How could I be worse than having a fatal disease that will kill me in a year or two? It could be worse. You can end up getting hepatitis, you could end up getting HIV, you could end up getting tumours, you could end up with all sorts of complications. So it's very important that clinicians actually explain the risks, benefits and rationale for that therapy. Which then leads you on to the clinical trial. So what is a clinical trial? What is a good clinical trial? What is a bad clinical trial? Well, a clinical trial is different from routine clinical practice. If you have an arthritic, rotten hip, you will want a hip replacement. You don't need to be part of a trial to have a hip replacement because everybody knows from trials in the past that hip replacement works. The same for clots in the coronary arteries if you have a stroke. A trial is there to see whether the therapy works. That is what a trial is about. So a good clinical trial is a trial that gives you a clear result or a clear amount of information. It is not a positive outcome. So trials which produce a very clear negative outcome are extremely valuable trials. So a good clinical trial has to be designed to get the maximum amount of information with the clearest outcome, regardless of whether it's positive or negative. So what do those sort of trials look like? Well, they clearly spend a lot of time, people who design clinical trials, around selecting the type of patient who would be most beneficial for this intervention. So, for example, in my own field of Parkinson's disease, there are thousands of people with Parkinson's disease, but for our cell-based therapy, we're very selective for those who would be most suitable for that therapy. So not everybody is suitable. So I cannot run a trial where anyone can phone me up and just turn up and have the therapy. That makes no sense. So a good trial has careful patient selection. A bad trial takes all comers with no consideration on that. The second is the therapeutic intervention. What is the rationale for that? How are you going to deliver it, and what are your expectations in terms of how it works? And so in order to achieve that, you have to have a very clear endpoint which you have defined before you've started the trial. So what will happen in 6 months' time, 1 year's time? It is not good enough to say, come into my clinic, have my therapy, go home in a week's time, you'll be terrific. That is not a trial. No one's following the patient up, no one knows what's going to happen, and you'll get no useful information. So a good clinical trial defines its endpoint and follows people up long term and collects the data prospectively as it goes. And the best clinical trials will follow people all the way till death, because that is the only way you'll know ultimately what your therapy has done. Anything that doesn't do that, people come in, fly out. Those are not trials. Those are not good trials. In fact, they're not trials at all. They're basically selling you fake therapies. So I think it's very important for people to understand the difference between a good clinical trial and a bad clinical trial. I think the other question that people then arises is there is this sort of misconception as well that in these trials, the reason why they can't have the therapy where they are is because it's already been proven somewhere else, and it's only in the UK, the NHS doesn't have enough money, in the US it's some ethical concern they have. There are many spurious reasons that people throw up as to why the trial is being done in some country other than the country in which they live. There is no reason for trials not to be done in any of these countries if they are proven to have some benefit and to take them forward. So I think people need to be very suspicious of trials where they have to travel abroad to undertake them, where the period of time in which they're under follow-up is extremely short, and also where they're having to pay. Because why would you have to pay for something that you're trying to take to a trial? So if I want to take a therapy into the clinic to see whether it works, it is incumbent on me to get that funded so I can properly do the trial, control the trial, get the data. The patients are entering into an experiment with me. They should not be paying for the privilege of having a therapy that I don't know what it's going to do. So I think those are some of the indicators as to what's a good and a bad trial. And the final points I just want to make about two other misconceptions or two other worries. One is this idea of patients using their own cells. So this has really caught on in recent years since the discovery of iPS cells, that people could have their own cells, they can have them taken out, manipulated and put back in. Well, we've already heard that can be dangerous. Even when people are thinking about this using more rigorous approaches, there are issues with it. So if you engineer a cell and you've taken it out of someone's body, you have no idea quite what you've done. So is that really safe? The other question in the world of brain diseases, if I want to take people's cells, turn them into the cells I want to replace in the brain, those patients have already got that disease. What's to stop those cells developing the disease again? Is it really the most sensible way forward? And the cost for this type of therapy is extremely high as it stands at the moment, if everyone wants to have their own personalised medicine. So whilst there's this great mantra on personalised medicine and autologous transplants, we can all produce the cells to treat ourselves. That's a wonderful aim, but at the moment, there's no such therapy as that which exists. And the final point is, which many of my colleagues have brought up, is about the speed with which you should take therapies from the lab into the clinic. The regulatory authorities are there to protect patients, they're there to protect physicians, they're there to make sure that things move at the right speed. There has always been a tendency for people to see that there is a lot of bureaucratic red tape in order to take things forward, and I think all of us who've been involved with that translation will realise that there is a lot of work that needs to be done. It is there for a good reason. While some of it can be streamlined, the more you streamline that process, the greater the risk will come, because people will be moving things into clinic at a speed which is ahead of where the science and the clinical evidence lies. And so I think there are great worries when you're looking to take therapies into the clinic, are what are fundamentally the motives of the people taking that therapy into clinic. We would like to think that every new stem cell therapy going into a clinical trial is to help patients. It is less clear to me that actually that is the case in many instances, where it's more about making money. I'll make money quick, and then I'll get out once people start getting suspicious. So I think it's very important that we keep our motives right. If we streamline the regulation, people will be racing into clinics to do unproven therapies and then scarpering off, leaving the physicians to pick up the damage which has happened to the patients, the poor patients who've been left with the disabilities that these therapies or the dashed hopes that they had, and the scientists to regroup around a therapy which has now been seen in the public eye to have failed despite all the scientific breakthroughs.
Thank you. That was really, really fascinating. So we'd like to open it up for questions. Yes. Yeah.
I have two questions. I'll ask the first one first. So you kind of touched on this, but if I'm a patient who wants to explore maybe getting into a trial, what should I do? And I ask in particular because I think it was in the Florida case where the women were blinded that some of them thought they were in a legitimate trial. So like, I mean, you kind of talked about this, but like, you know, help a patient out maybe.
Excuse me. So I think that's great. Absolutely a very important question. How do patients know the difference? I'd ask the panel, maybe Megan.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a very good question, and it's very difficult, is the answer, because what a lot of people do is they'll look at things like clinicaltrials.gov and say that, you see, it's listed. So if it's listed on there, people assume that these are legitimate clinical trials. In essence, this is just a place to register if you're doing any clinical trial. Doesn't tell you anything about the merit of it, doesn't tell you how it got to where it is in the clinical trial. So my own view is that if you want to get into a clinical trial, then most people wanting to get into a clinical trial will have a condition where they will be seeing a physician or a surgeon or whoever. It is then incumbent, I think, on them to go to that physician, clinician, and have a conversation with them about the legitimacy of that therapy that they have looked into. I think if they feel, having spoken to that person, that they're not competent to comment on it, then I think that physician should refer them to someone else, or they should refer them to some resources. Mm-hmm. I do not think it should be up to the patient to just look on the web, find a trial, and then go there. I think they do need advice, and that, I think, was one of the points I was trying to make, that I think clinicians have a responsibility to that. Patients normally trust their physicians, and physicians mustn't abuse that trust by giving an honest account. And in my own experience, I get probably every day somebody emailing me wanting to go to a trial somewhere in the world for some therapy to do with neurological diseases. And whilst it's hard to say, I had one this morning, hypoxic brain injury, can I have pig cells? That was today's email. I said, it's been tried in Parkinson's disease. There's no evidence that it would ever work in a hypoxic brain injury. There are no trials worldwide that would merit that. I think, if you have money to spend, you're much better investing it on rehab, physio, and things of that nature.
If I could just add, I think I completely agree with what Roger's mentioned, and certainly we want people to talk to their treating specialist who knows them best of all, and their condition, their progress, and the field. Because if there is a promising clinical trial opportunity in your country, your specialist will know about it. Having said that, though, I wanted to raise that a lot of people we spoke to who had made the decision to travel had an enormous distrust with their treating doctors at home. So I think relying solely on that is a problem. So one of the thing I wanted to mention was that there are a lot of fantastic sort of patient support and advocacy groups. So one of the other things that we do is we work very closely with them, so that if they get inquiries, they're hearing a similar message to what they're hearing from their specialists. So perhaps reinforcing that, because again, if there's a promising opportunity to treat multiple sclerosis, then our Multiple Sclerosis Australia will know about it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Just very brief. For those of you who are writing stories intended to serve as kind of a cautionary note for people in the U.S. market, one of the important distinctions that people should make is that not all clinical trials are actually supervised by the FDA. And so that may be one good sign, or even a question that they can ask when they approach a business that has registered a so-called clinical trial at clinicaltrials.gov, which is a government-run website. That is not necessarily an indicator that that is on that pathway which is supervised and is regulated by the FDA for a kind of a multi-stage test, first to determine signal of reasonable safety, enough safety to proceed to study things like preliminary signs of efficacy, and then finally in a large population that could show that it really does work to treat the condition that it's intended for. A lot of the trials that are registered on this website, clinicaltrials.gov, are simply privately registered and unsupervised and essentially unregulated medical experiments that people are being required to pay thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars to serve as research subjects in badly designed medical experiments. So for those of you who are writing stories that are targeting patients, I encourage you to make that point that that's not necessarily the sole information resource they should rely on.
Thank you.
Sorry, second question.
Yeah.
I guess it seems like sort of all these clinics popped up and the scientific community has had to try to respond, and it's like in Texas, bills get introduced and you have to try to respond to those. I know 1 out of 3 became law, so it's like, and now the FDA is kind of punted, for lack of a better term. So, I mean, how are you trying to go from playing defense on these things to moving to be like more, or if you are, being more offensive, for lack of a better term?
Yes. So I think Doug.
Yeah, so this is something that's actively being discussed by some committees within the ISSCR. Even this morning, we had some discussions about ways to, not just to work with the FDA, but to maybe engage at the state level medical boards to look possible involvement with the Federal Trade Commission because of truth in advertising issues with the claims being made. There are possibilities with law enforcement. There are some of the possibilities I talked about with tort reform, again at the state level, where you can change the laws specifically requiring businesses that advertise stem cells to provide additional protections and additional information to patients. So the ISSCR, of course, as an organization, it doesn't have infinite resources and it does have to choose its fights. So one of the strategies will be to work with patient and disease advocacy organizations, work with other professional organizations, maybe reach out to medical regulatory organizations like the OPMC at the federal level. So there are a number of programs that we're now deciding which ways are the best ways to invest ISSCR's administrative and scientific resources.
Thank you.
So thanks for the question. I just wanted to give an Australian flavour, because I first got involved in this area 10 years ago as part of ICCR, as part of sort of forming guidelines, and we were seeing Australians travelling abroad. But in late 2011, I had my first inquiry from a patient, actually from a husband of a woman with Parkinson's disease, who talked about how she was offered treatment by a cosmetic surgeon. And I thought, my goodness, how can this be happening here in Australia? Surely not. And so I would say that I feel like I have been on the attack for 5 years, but it's been very difficult because this area is emerging, it's new. I feel that at least from my country's perspective, at a national level, there's a fear or at least some hesitancy to step in and regulate too heavily because they don't want to stifle innovation. And of course, this just creates a fertile ground. And just like in the US, I've seen from one clinic, now we have about 77 on our books. So perhaps not quite at the scale as the US, but per capita, it's quite up there. So it's a huge frustration to us. And we, at a national level, have found it really helpful having ICCR sitting there with us, also reinforcing that this is not acceptable. So I just wanted to make a comment that I don't think we're playing defence, really. I think we've been playing attack for some time.
And Roger, I'm interested also to hear whether, is this a problem in the UK? Are you managing it better, perhaps.
It doesn't appear to be a problem in the UK, but that might be because it's so well hidden that we don't actually see it. But I mean, it is a problem with people, especially going to China. Actually, we have a lot of patients who go to China and come back from China with these unproven cell-based therapies. And of course, the difficulty is trying to, if you like, legislate outside of your own country. So, you know, I think, you know, one of the things we could perhaps be more aggressive is clinicians who are practicing this type of medicine. Because this is fraudulent medicine. And, you know, if you're doing fraudulent research and you're a scientist, you would be thrown out. So there is no reason that physicians should escape from this under some pretense that they're helping patients in desperate needs with unproven therapies. So many countries have sort of national, you know, in the UK we have the General Medical Council, so you will be reported to the General Medical Council. They will investigate you, and I think physicians should be struck off or suspended if these trials are seen that they are leading on them. Now, the problem comes, of course, is I can do that in the UK, so I could report someone to the GMC. But if you're in China, I don't know who to report you to. And so that is the problem, I think. It's the international perspective which makes it difficult. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't put your own house in order first. But I think that is an issue, and I think somehow trying to get professional organisations around physicians and clinicians to regulate their own members is vital, because they are the gatekeepers to these trials. If you could stop them, you could stop the trials.
I agree. In the US, states have, for example, they have offices of professional misconduct, and patients can report directly to them what has happened to them, adverse events that they've experienced, and they will investigate. And to the extent that you can then restrict or remove licenses through this type of mechanisms, I think that it could be a very effective way to go. And are there any other questions? And also from people on the phone.
Hi. Can I ask a question?
Oh, yes. Yes, sir.
Hi. I'm calling from Florida. I'm a journalist too. My name is Diane Wade. And I would like to ask anyone on the panel their thoughts on where has been the regulatory will for this industry. I mean, it seems that, you know, both on the medical, you know, for medical practice and which the FDA or, as you said, state board of health can govern, and on the deceptive and unfair trade end. I mean, if you look at some of the ads, that there's quite clear violations going on, and yet when you look closely at this, there's been almost no enforcement. And I would be, and that's regulation that exists now. I'm just curious why people feel this is happening this way.
Yeah. Just moving the mic.
This is Doug Sipp. I think clearly it's a complex phenomenon, and we've seen in the U.S. in particular that medicine has become more and more of a commercial and a consumer-driven activity, even in comparison to other advanced countries today. And that's been something that's been growing and evolving over the past 50 years or more. So there's part of it is just the general kind of ecosystem in which healthcare is operating in America emphasizes this idea of increasing the amount of patient autonomy to make choices, but also shifting risks and burdens of costs from providers, professional caregivers, to the buyers and to the payers, for example, the reimbursement systems. So part of it is it actually at a level that is higher than just the stem cell research phenomenon or the research community. It's something that is, we see it in other areas of American medicine as well. There's been a flourishing, I think, of these so-called alternative or unorthodox medicines that are straining the resources of the regulatory apparatuses that are in place. So here at this meeting, we focus on stem cells, and so that's what we mainly look at. But there are lots of different kinds of medical fraud. and these kind of pseudo-medical products and services out there available, which are also putting a strain on the system. So we, as a stem cell society, of course, want to emphasize the importance of this particular area, but we also have to recognize that all of the different regulatory agencies and offices and law enforcement resources that are in place have other things that are also calling for their attention. So a major role, I think, for our society is to maintain a focus on the importance of this particular phenomenon while recognizing that it's taking place in a broader phenomenon.
Thank you, Megan.
So Megan Munsey here. I just wanted to add to Doug's thoughts and perhaps reflect upon what happened in Germany in 2011. Mm-hmm. So there was a company that had previously been operating in, I believe, the Netherlands, until it was pushed out of the Netherlands, set up in Germany, and was operating. And we knew about it because a lot of Australians were travelling, as I think a lot of Americans and other people were. Now, my colleagues in Germany were very concerned about the practice and were trying to get regulators to perhaps do something about it. But it wasn't until there was catastrophic consequences for some children, one who was had some serious complications, another who died. And that's when they stepped in. Mm-hmm. So going back to the question, I think sometimes, perhaps because of the resources issue that Doug alluded to, there has to be a trigger. And I suppose I would argue, do we have to wait that long? Why do we have to wait that long? Mm-hmm. When perhaps we can foresee the serious consequences of some of these interventions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Thank you.
I think just on that point, I think you have to pick your fights. And the case I was thinking of was the stamina case in Italy, where basically an unproven stem cell therapy was set up with huge support from patient families, and it actually took a very concerted effort by scientists and clinicians, not only within Italy, but actually across Europe, to raise alarm bells about this, which actually, we're fortunate in Italy because one of the leading stem cell biologists is also a senator, so that helps, but actually to then drive through this sort of regulatory system and legislation to actually get that clinic closed down. So I think there are limited resources, and some of these therapies are going to be more dangerous than others. And actually trying to pick your fight, but actually be prepared to stand up and fight, because in Italy this caused huge issues because the patients were out on the street, the patients' families were out on the streets. It looked like the cruel medics and scientists were and the politicians were preventing this clearly effective therapy. So you have to be brave, you have to pick your fights. But I think if enough people are concerted behind it, you can actually really make a difference.
So it's almost, the will may be there, but they need the trigger, they need the motivation. And I would say that we really need to be active, because if we pick up the phone and we call and we write letters to the regulatory agencies and raise concerns, I think that is going to be effective. And certainly ISSCR is forming coalitions with other organizations that are very, very concerned about this, concerned about protecting patients, but individuals as well are very effective at reporting. And, as your point is well taken, you don't want to wait until you get to that dreadful point. So, thank you.